The wind in Wyoming doesn't just blow, it hunts. It moves through the canyons of the Grand Tetons like a living thing, searching for anything loose, anything weak, anything that doesn't belong. And on this particular Tuesday in late November, Julian clearly did not belong. He was a man of straight lines and concrete, an architect from Chicago who spent his days looking at blueprints and his nights looking at the glowing skyline of a city that never slept. He had come out west looking for inspiration, for a jagged edge to break up the monotony of his structured life. He wanted to see the chaotic geometry of nature. He had parked his rental car at the trailhead, confident in his expensive hiking boots and his brand new thermal jacket. He had checked the weather app on his phone. It said clear skies. But the mountains do not care about apps, and they do not care about plans. By 3 in the afternoon, the blue sky had turned the color of a bruised plum. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 20 minutes, and then the snow began. It wasn't the gentle, drifting snow of a Christmas movie. It was hard, horizontal pellets of ice that stung the skin. Julian turned back, but the trail was gone. The whiteout was absolute. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in his chest. He stumbled, his foot finding not solid rock but a patch of slick black ice hidden beneath the fresh powder. The snap was loud, echoing like a gunshot in the silent valley. Julian cried out, falling hard. He slid 10 feet down an embankment, coming to a stop against the rough bark of a pine tree. The pain in his ankle was immediate and blinding, a hot spike of agony that made his vision blur. He tried to stand, but his leg collapsed under him. It was miles from the road. The sun was setting. The cold was already seeping through his layers, a numbness starting in his fingers and toes. He shouted for help, but the wind swallowed his voice. He sat there for what felt like hours, shivering violently, watching the light fade from the world. He thought about his apartment in Chicago, the warmth of the radiators, the coffee shop on the corner. It all seemed like a dream now. He closed his eyes, the heaviness of hypothermia beginning to settle over him like a heavy blanket. He was going to die here, a statistic, a foolish tourist who underestimated the wild. Then he heard it. The crunch of hooves on snow, the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a large animal. Julian forced his eyes open. Through the swirling white, a shape emerged. A horse, black as the coming night, massive and steaming in the cold air. On its back, a rider. The rider pulled on the reins, and the horse stopped, snorting. Julian tried to speak, but his teeth were chattering too hard. The rider dismounted in one fluid motion. It wasn't a park ranger. It was a woman. She was dressed in a heavy shearling coat that had seen better days, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low and leather chaps over denim. She had a rifle scabbard on her saddle, and her eyes, when she looked at him, were not filled with pity. They were filled with annoyance. "You're on Ironwood land," she said. Her voice was husky, roughened by the dry air. She didn't offer a hand. She just looked at him, then at his twisted ankle. "And you're about to freeze to death." I got lost," Julian stammered, his voice barely a whisper. She sighed, a puff of white steam escaping her lips. City folk, always thinking the mountain is a postcard. She knelt, her gloved hands probing his ankle. He hissed in pain. "It's broken. Maybe a fracture. Maybe worse. Can you stand if I help you?" "I think so," Julian lied. She scoffed. "No, you can't. But we don't have a choice." She hauled him up. She was smaller than him, but she possessed a wiry, ranch-born strength that shocked him. She got him to the horse-a-beast. She called midnight and managed to get him into the saddle. She swung up behind him, her arms going around his waist to grab the reins, her chest pressed against his back.
Ow.
For the first time in hours, Julian felt warmth. "My name is Julian," he managed to say as the horse began to trudge through the deep snow. "I didn't ask," she replied sharp, "and don't get comfortable. My father, Silas, he doesn't take kindly to trespassers, especially not the kind that need saving. Where are we going?" "The main house is too far," she shouted over the rising wind. "And if I take you there, Silas might just shoot you for spooking the herd before he asks if you're okay. I'm taking you to the line shack." The ride was a blur of pain and cold, punctuated only by the steady warmth of the woman behind him. Julian slipped in and out of consciousness. When the horse finally stopped, it was pitch black. He saw the outline of a small, timber-framed cabin half buried in a drift. She helped him down, practically carrying him inside. The air in the shack was stale and freezing, smelling of old pine resin and dust. She sat him on a cot with a thin mattress. "Stay," she commanded. She moved in the dark with practiced ease. Within minutes, a match flared. She lit an oil lantern, casting a golden glow over the small, rough space. Then she busied herself at the wood stove. Soon, the crackle of fire filled the silence, and the room began to thaw. She turned to him, removing her hat. Julian blinked. She was striking, not pretty in the polished, makeup-heavy way of the women he dated in Chicago. She was beautiful in the way a mountain face, his beautiful sharp angles, wind-burned cheeks, eyes the color of the pine needles outside. Her hair, a dark mahogany, was pulled back in a loose, messy braid. "I'm Elara," she said, finally looking at him with something other than irritation. "And you, Julian, are a mess." That was the beginning. For the next 3 days, Julian lived in a world that consisted of 4 wooden walls, the crackle of the stove, and Elara. She would leave before dawn to tend to her ranch duties, assuring her father didn't suspect anything. She would return at midday with food thermoses of hot stew, chunks of cornbread, strips of dried jerky, and she would return again in the evening to change the bandages on his ankle and check the fire. It was during these evenings that the world shifted for Julian. He learned that the Ironwood Ranch had been in her family for 4 generations. He learned that her father, Silas, was a man carved from the same granite as the mountains hard, unyielding and fiercely protective of his land against developers and tourists. "He thinks the city is a disease," Elara told him on the second night. Sitting in the rocking chair by the stove, while Julian sketched her profile in a small notebook he always carried, "He thinks people like you come here to take things. To pave over the wild, I build things," Julian said softly, shading the curve of her jaw on the paper. "But not like that. I like to think I build spaces for people to live, to feel safe." "Safety is a myth out here," Elara replied, looking into the fire. "There's only survival. And duty. Is that all you have? Duty?" She looked at him then, and the air in the small cabin grew thick. "It's what I have. It's who I am. I run the herd. I fix the fences. I keep the Ironwood name alive." "What about what you want?" Julian asked. Elara didn't answer. She stood up and walked over to him to check his leg. Her hands were gentle now. When her fingers brushed his skin, Julian felt a jolt that had nothing to do with the pain in his bone. He looked up at her and she paused. They were close, breathing the same warm wood smoke air. He saw the specks of gold in her green eyes, Saw the hesitation, the fear, and the longing. "You need to heal," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "so you can leave." "I don't want to leave," Julian admitted. The truth of it surprised him. He missed nothing about Chicago. He didn't miss the noise, the emails, the rushing. He only wanted this, the quiet. Fire her. "You have to," she said, pulling back. "If Silas finds you, he won't understand. He'll see an invader. He'll see a threat." But she didn't leave that night. She stayed until the fire burned low, talking to him about the stars, about the way the aspen trees turned gold in September, about the horses she loved. And Julian told her about the museums, the way light reflected off the lake in the summer, the jazz clubs. They were trading worlds, weaving a fragile thread between the skyscraper and the canyon. On the third afternoon, the bubble burst. The door to the lion shack didn't open. It was kicked in. The light poured in, blindingly white against the dim interior. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the snow. He was massive, wearing a duster coat that reached his boots and a hat that cast his face in shadow. But Julian could see the eyes. They were Elara's eyes, but void of any warmth. They were cold, hard flint. Silas Ironwood, holding a live-action rifle. Elara, who had just been pouring coffee from a thermos, froze. "Daddy," she breathed. "I saw the smoke," Silas said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "I thought it was vagrants, drifters." He stepped into the room, his gaze landing on Julian like a physical blow. "But I see it's worse. It's a guest." He looked at Elara, his expression one of deep betrayal. "You're hiding a man, stranger." "On our land?" "He was hurt, Daddy," Elara said, stepping between Julian and her father. Her voice was strong, but Julian could see her hands shaking. "He would have died in the storm. I couldn't just leave him. You could have brought him to the house. You could have told me. I knew what you'd do." Elara snapped. "You'd have run him off before he could walk. You hate anyone from the outside." Silas lowered the rifle, but his posture didn't relax. He walked over to Julian, towering over him. Julian tried to sit up straighter, to look the man in the eye. He was terrified, but he wouldn't show it. "You from the city?" Silas asked. "Chicago," Julian said. "Sir," Silas spat on the floorboards figures. "You get yourself broken, and my daughter has to play nursemaid. You're a liability, son, and you're trespassing." "I intend to pay you for the trouble," Julian started. "Your money is no good here," Silas cut him off. "We trade in work and respect. You have neither." He turned to Elara. "Get the truck. We're taking him to town now." "Daddy, his leg." "Now, Elara," Silas roared. The sound shook the dust from the rafters. The drive to the small town of Jackson was silent and suffocating. Julian sat in the back of the rusted pickup truck, wrapped in blankets, his leg throbbing. Elara drove, her eyes fixed on the road, tears silently tracking down her dusty cheeks. Silas sat in the passenger seat, a stone wall of judgment. When they reached the urgent care clinic, Silas opened the door and dragged Julian out. He dumped him in a wheelchair by the entrance. "Don't come back," Silas said, leaning close. "Stay in your concrete world. The Ironwood Ranch is for people who can survive it." He turned and walked away. Elara lingered for a second. She looked at Julian, her heart in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Elara Julian reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "Goodbye, Julian." She got back in the truck and drove away, leaving him sitting in the wheelchair, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the crushing weight of loss. Act 3. The Exile. Julian returned to Chicago. He went to the hospital, got a cast, got crutches, and went back to his apartment on the 30th floor. His life was exactly as he had left it. The coffee machine was on the timer. Blueprints were on the table. City lights twinkled outside his floor 2 ceiling windows. But it was all wrong. The silence of the apartment wasn't the peaceful silence of the line shack. It was a lonely, empty vacuum. The air smelled of recycled AC, not pine and wood smoke. I tried to work, but every line he drew looked like a mountain range. Every face he sketched turned into hers. He was miserable. Checked his phone constantly, though he knew she wouldn't call. She didn't even have his number. He looked at the weather reports for Wyoming every morning. Snow showers, high winds. Was she out there? Was she warm? 2 weeks passed, then 3. His leg was healing, the cast replaced by a walking boot. His boss praised his new designs, saying they had a rugged, organic quality he hadn't seen before. Julian felt like a fraud. He couldn't do it. He couldn't pretend that the last month hadn't happened. He couldn't pretend that his heart wasn't 2,000 miles away, beating in a chest that wasn't his own. He didn't pack much, just his drafting gear, his warm clothes, and his savings. He quit his job on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday night, he was driving west. He didn't go to the Ironwood Ranch. He knew Silas would shoot him on sight. Instead, he rented a small, run-down cabin on the outskirts of the neighboring property. It was barely more than a shack itself, but it had a view of the Ironwood fence line. He began to wait. He spent his days fixing up the cabin and his evenings watching the ridge with a pair of binoculars. He was looking for a black horse. He was looking for her. It took 4 days. He saw her riding the perimeter, checking the barbed wire fences. She looked smaller from this distance, slumped in the saddle. She wasn't the fierce warrior he remembered. She looked defeated. Julian didn't shout. He didn't wave. He waited until nightfall. Then he hiked to the fence line, ignoring the ache in his healing ankle. He tied a piece of white cloth, a handkerchief, to the fence post where he had seen her stop. Inside the cloth, he wrapped a sketch. It was a drawing of her in the line shack, the firelight in her hair. On the back, he wrote a single line, "I'm at the Miller cabin. I'm not leaving." Oh. The next day, the cloth was gone. At night, Julian sat on the porch of his rented cabin, wrapped in a blanket, watching the dark woods. He heard the snap of a twig, then another. She emerged from the trees like a spirit. She wasn't on her horse. She had walked, sneaking out. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her breath clouding in the moonlight. Julian stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. He limped down the steps. "You're crazy," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You came back." "I couldn't stay away," Julian said. He stopped a few feet from her. "I tried. It didn't work. My father... if he knows you're here... "I don't care about your father," Julian said fiercely. "I care about you. I care about us." She closed the distance between them. She collided with him, burying her face in his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, smelling the familiar scent of leather and sage. She was shaking. "I missed you," she sobbed. "God, I missed you so much. It's been so cold without you." "I'm here," he whispered into her hair. "I'm not going anywhere." For the next month, they lived a double life. A clandestine romance hidden in the shadows of the Tetons. Elara would sneak out 2 or 3 times a week. They would sit by his fire, eating dinner, talking, dreaming. Julian showed her his new designs barns that used natural light, houses that flowed with the land instead of fighting it. Elara taught him how to read the weather, how to track elk, how to exist in the wild without fighting it. They were surrounding the problem, circling the reality of her father, stealing moments of happiness in the dead of winter. It was dangerous, it was exhausting, and it was the happiest Julian had ever been. But secrets in a small town are like sparks in a hayloft, so eventually they catch fire. It was mid-January when the storm of the decade hit. They called it a bomb cyclone. The pressure dropped, and the sky turned a terrifying shade of green-black. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing shingles off roofs and snapping trees like toothpicks. Julian was at his cabin, boarding up the windows, when his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Help. Barn roof buckling. Dad trapped. Can't get out." It was Elara. Julian didn't think. He didn't hesitate. Grabbed his keys, his heavy coat, and his tools. He drove his truck into the teeth of the storm. The roads were barely passable. Drifts were piling up 3 feet high. He engaged the 4-wheel drive, pushing the engine to its limit. He reached the ironwood gate. It was blown open. He drove up the long driveway, visibility near zero. When he reached the main house, he saw the chaos. The main barn, a massive, ancient structure, was groaning under the weight of the snow. The roof was sagging dangerously in the middle. He could hear shouting from inside. Julian jumped out of the truck. The wind nearly knocked him over. He fought his way to the barn doors. Inside, it was pandemonium. Horses were thrashing in their stalls, terrified. Elara was frantically trying to shore up a support beam with a loose plank, but she wasn't strong enough. And there was Silas. The old man was on the ground, his leg pinned under a fallen beam. He was conscious, gritting his teeth in pain, shouting instructions that no one could hear over the roaring wind. Elara looked up and saw Julian. Her eyes went wide. Julian. Julian ran to her. He looked at the roof. His architect's brain took over instantly. He saw the load vectors. He saw the point of failure. "We have to brace the crossbeam." Julian yelled over the noise. "That snaps, the whole thing comes down." "I can't move it," Elara screamed. "I can." Julian grabbed a heavy timber from a pile of lumber near the door. It was heavy, too heavy for a man with a bad ankle, but adrenaline is a powerful drug. "Help me wedge it." Together, they jammed the timber under the sagging truss. Julian used a sledgehammer to drive it into place. The wood groaned, protested, and then held. The sagging stopped. Julian didn't stop there. He ran to Silas. The old man looked up at him, shock washing over his pain-filled face. Silas grunted. "Save the speeches," Julian said. He grabbed a crowbar. "Elara, on the count of 3. Pull him. 1, 2, 3. Julian leveraged the beam up with every ounce of strength he had. His muscles screamed. His bad ankle flared with agony. The beam lifted just an inch. Elara dragged her father free. They collapsed on the straw-covered floor, gasping for air. The barn shook. The wind battered the walls, but the brace held. For a long moment, the only sound was the heavy breathing of the 3 humans and the nervous whickering of the horses. Silas sat up, clutching his injured leg. He looked at the makeshift brace holding up the roof. He looked at the timber, positioned perfectly to distribute the load. It was a piece of engineering genius, executed in seconds. Then he looked at Julian. He looked at the city boy, the trespasser, the architect. He saw the sweat on Julian's face, the dirt on his coat, the fierce determination in his eyes. Silas looked at Elara, who was kneeling beside Julian, her hand on his shoulder, checking him for injuries. He saw the way she looked at him, not like a stranger, like a partner. Silas cleared his throat. It was a rough, gravelly sound. "That brace," Silas said, pointing a shaking finger at the roof. "It's holding." "It'll hold for tonight," Julian said, his voice raspy. "But you need a new roof. The pitch is too shallow for this much snow. The load bearing is all wrong." Silas nodded slowly. He looked at Julian's ankle. "You walked on that bad leg." "I drove on it," Julian corrected. "I ran on it." "Why?" Silas asked. "I threw you out. I told you never to come back." Julian looked at Elara. He took her hand, interlacing their fingers right there in front of the old man. He didn't care anymore, 'cause she called. Julian said simply, "And because I belong here. Maybe not on a horse, maybe not roping cattle, but I can build. I can fix. And I love your daughter, sir. I love her more than I love the city, more than I love anything." Silas looked at their joined hands. He looked at the barn that was still standing because of this man. He looked at his daughter, who was looking at him with a defiance he hadn't seen since her mother died. The old man let out a long, ragged breath. He leaned his head back against a hay bale. "Well," Silas grumbled, "if you're going to rebuild my roof, you better not charge me city prices." Elara let out a sob that was half laugh. She squeezed Julian's hand so hard it hurt. Julian smiled, exhausted and aching, but victorious. "I work for trade, sir. Room and board." Silas closed his eyes. A faint, almost invisible smile tugged at the corner of his mouth under his mustache. "There's a guest room in the main house. It's better than the line shack. Don't make me regret it." The final minutes. New roots. Spring comes late to Wyoming, but when it arrives, it is glorious. The valleys turn a shocking shade of green, and the wildflowers explode in riots of purple and yellow. 6 months had passed since the storm. On the south side of the Ironwood property, a new structure was rising. It was a barn, but it wasn't like the old ones. It had high vaulted ceilings and reinforcements designed to withstand a 100-year storm. It was beautiful, functional, and strong. Julian stood on a ladder, hammering the final trim into place. He wore denim now and work boots that were scuffed and muddy. His hands were calloused, his face was tanned. He wasn't the pale architect from Chicago anymore. He was something new, a hybrid. He heard a whistle and looked down. Elara was standing there, holding 2 cold lemonades. She was smiling up at him, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Lunch break, Cowboy," she called out. Julian climbed down, took the lemonade and kissed her, a long, lingering kiss that tasted of sunshine and sugar. "How's it looking?" he asked, looking up at his work. "It's perfect," she said. "Dad loves it. He won't admit it, but I caught him bragging to the neighbors about his son-in-law's design." "Soon-in-law, huh?" Julian grinned. "We haven't set a date yet." "We will," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "After the spring calving, we have work to do." They turned and looked out over the ranch. In the distance, they could see Silas riding Midnight, checking the herd. He paused and waved a hand at them. Julian waved back. He thought about the skyline of Chicago, thought about the noise and the rush. And he looked at the mountains, silent and eternal, guarding the valley. He looked at the woman beside him who had saved his life and then given him a new one. "You know," Julian said softly, "I used to think success was building the tallest thing in the sky. And now?" Elara asked. Julian put his arm around her, pulling her close as the wind gentle now, carrying the scent of pine brushed past them. "Now I know," he said. "Success isn't about how high you build. It's about how deep your roots go." They stood there together, watching the shadows of the clouds move across the land, Two people from different worlds who had met in the storm and decided to build a shelter together. And in the vast, wild silence of Wyoming, that was enough.